Today we're going to talk about the 960 grid system. The 960 grid system is a CSS framework. So you'll hear this word framework a lot. What's a framework? A framework is a bunch of things that somebody put together for you already, right? So 960 is just CSS, but it takes a lot of the things that we do all the time and kind of puts them together for us in a way and makes it real easy for us to use without having to manually make it every time we do a website. And in particular, the 960 grid system helps with columns, right? So we always make columns on our websites, and you guys have done 2-column websites already. The process you go through every time you do that's going to be the same thing. Well, the 960 grid system attempts to simplify that and make it easy so we can rapidly prototype our site layouts using the grid system and the CSS elements that they give us to make our lives easier. So let's scroll down here a little bit. This is their website. It's 960.gs is the place where you go to get it. And in a little bit, we're going to download it using the big old download button. It's always right there, first thing that you see. If you want to get the 960 grid system, you come here and click on it. We'll do that in a little bit. It's not big. It's not hard. But let's take a look at some of the things on this page. So the 960 grid system is an effort to streamline web development workflow by providing commonly used dimensions based on a width of 960 pixels. I told you when you were doing your websites before that 960 is a pretty popular size. It fits on most browsers well. It fits on iPads and things like that pretty well. So if you're going to do a fixed width website, that's a pretty good size to use. Almost everybody's monitor can display 960 pixels wide because most of them are at least 1024 wide. There are two variants, 12 and 16 columns. We're going to use the 12 column variant to start out with, but that's okay because if you know how to use that, you can use the 16 column variant. And I'll show you there's just one little command you change to use the 16 column one, and then all the principles are the same. So we're going to do the 12 column variant. Okay. So what is it? So you got 960 pixels, right? The 12 column grid is divided into portions that are 60 pixels wide. So if you take 12 times 60, you get 720, right? But that's not quite 960, is it? So let's think about it a minute. 16 column grid is 40 pixel increments. And here's the part where the rest of those pixels are taken up. Each column has 10 pixels of margin on the left and the right, which creates 20 pixel wide gutters between the columns. Okay, so every one of those 12 columns has 20 columns between it and then 10 on the right and left side. If you add all that up, you're going to get 960 pixels. Let's click this view demo. And it kind of shows you a little diagram. These red stripes are the columns for the 12 column grid system. Okay, and each column is 60 pixels wide. And they've got them broken down here into single columns all the way. In between each column is a 20 pixel gutter. Okay, so it's 10 columns. So let's look at this one up here. It's 10 pixels on the right side of that, and it would be 10 pixels on the left side of that for their margins, which creates a 20 pixel gutter. And over here on the left, it's got 10 pixels as well. So there's a left margin of 10 pixels and a right margin of 10 pixels here, with all these gutters being 20 apiece. So if you start adding those up, you see that if we do 60 here plus a 10, a 20 pixel gutter, that leaves 860 for these 11 columns, and then the 10 pixel margin on the end. Okay. So all that math that we have to do to calculate to make our columns and our margins and everything add up to the width of our page, the grid system is going to take care of that for us. We don't have to worry so much about that. We're only going to be concerned is like, hey, how many columns is this section going to take? And if I want it to take 3 columns and then another section to take 9 columns, so 3 columns plus 9 columns equals 12, right? We can fill up our page and make our columns really easy with this system. And you'll see how. I'll actually show you the mechanics of how it's done in a little bit. But all this math of figuring out how wide each column should be to still leave padding or still leave margins between our elements and things, it's all done for us. Okay. So down here are some examples. Here's a 3 column wide followed by a 3 column wide followed by a single column followed by 5 columns. Adds up to 12 columns. And as long as you fill out your rows, you really don't have too many problems with this. Here's a 16 grid version. It kind of works the same way, but we're not going to deal with the 16 grid version. Let's go down and look at some example pages of websites that have used the 960 grid. Let's look at one that's very, very obvious. Oh, a lot of them are pretty obvious. This Tapbots is pretty obvious. If we look at this, we have this big picture right here, this top section. We also have a header up here that takes up the whole width of the screen. But then we have 3 columns here. So if you wanted to make 3 equally spaced columns and you had a 12 column format to pick with, you would know that each one of this must be 4 columns here and 4 columns here and 4 columns there. And these pictures, since there's 4 of them, must be 3 apiece. They have space for 3 apiece, and there's that 20 pixel gutter between each one of them. Here's the 20 pixel gutter between each of those. And they actually have a button here where I can turn on the grid to see that. So up here at the top, we can see there's 12 columns going across for the big picture of the big bird there. And then these pictures here, 1, 2, 3, 4 columns, and then a gutter, then 1, 2, 3, 4 columns for that one. And you can see the layout. So that's the whole idea. To get the system, you hit the big old download button. Okay? And it's going to download a zip file. It's that fast. It's not big. It's just a few text files. Okay? That's going to come into your downloads folder. So we can right click on that and extract it. And let's look and see what comes in the folder. Okay, here's the master folder. And in here, we have app plugins. These are plugins for people who are expert in Photoshop or Fireworks if they want to use this system inside there. We're not really going to do that, so we don't need that folder. Get rid of it. I'd hit delete button and it's gone. The code we're going to need. So the code, we'll talk about that in a minute. I'm going to come back to the code. Licenses, GPL license. That's the new GNU General Public License. We'll talk about GNU later on. Basically, this is a type of license that lets you use this, lets you give it to somebody else. That's always a good thing to see. We don't really need the licenses for our coding project, so I'm going to get rid of that. There's logo files. If you want to include their logo file on your page, they give you a little 960 file you can use. They have rules about how you use it. They're here for you to use. If you put it in a third-party theme template or tool, I ask that you use the logo. So if you're going to give it to somebody else, inside some other thing that you might be selling or using, you need to use that logo. We're just using it for our personal use, so we don't really care about that folder. Okay. Sketch sheets, those can come in handy. They're just PDF files that let you sketch out your site. So I want to sketch out my site, and when I do it, it's already got the 12 columns there. So after I make a little sketch of my site on here, I can go through and count the columns. That's a nice tool if you want to use it. I usually use a page layout tool of some kind, and I don't get super picky about doing everything exact. Again, I'm not a designer. If I was, maybe I'd draw very exact wire diagrams of this, but we're coders, we're not designers. So I don't use this sheet too often, but you are welcome to use it if you want to lay out your site in very exact form. I'll show you what I do when I actually start showing you coding examples. So they have 16 column versions, 12 column versions, 24 column versions. So I didn't talk about, there's also a 24 column flavor of the 960 framework. So we really don't need the sketch sheets. So what I'm doing here is breaking down what you actually need out of this file. Here's a whole bunch of templates. So if you're using GIMP and you want to use the 960, it's got a template built into it. If you're using Adobe InDesign, it's got a template you can pull into Adobe InDesign. If you're using Photoshop, there's a template you can pull in here for a 960 grid layout. We're not using any of these tools because we're coders. We're just using Notepad or Notepad++ probably. So I don't really need any of the templates for what I'm doing. Look at that. There's a Git Ignore. Let's open it in Notepad. We're going to ignore any files that say .ds_store. Okay, very small Git Ignore file in case we want to do this in a repo, which we do. And I will give you the repo to clone later. You can download this for now if you want to go along with the videos, but when it comes time to do your project, I'm going to give you a starting repo to clone to actually make your working project out of. And then you'll push it back up so I can see your code and we can share code. And there's a readme.md file in here too. Let's open that. So the 960 grid system, it tells all about the grid system. I'm going to leave those two files in there because eventually I may end up making a repo out of this, and all repos should have a readme and an MD file, so I'll use those as the starting points. So let's go back to this code folder and talk about what's in there. Okay. In our code folder, we have demo HTML. So let's open that, and you will see that it's just that thing I showed you before with the pink lines showing the columns and how big. If you're using a 3-column section, it's going to be 220 pixels wide. It's just a map of those. It's online as well. I really don't need the demo file, although the demo does give me a template. So let's open this. I don't need all the stuff in the body of this, okay, unless I want to make that exact website that they did with the pink columns and everything. I don't really need all that. But what I want to show you is at the top, they have a link to a bunch of style sheets. And we're going to go look at where those are at right now. So they're importing one called Reset CSS. I don't know if, I think we've talked about resets already. Reset CSS basically takes all your margins and paddings back to zeros, right? It resets everything so that all web browsers have the same default settings, okay? They have a default file for formatting text. So these are all in the CSS folder. And you can see there's a bunch of them. Now, we're doing 960 CSS. I don't need that one. I don't need any of these for 24 or 16. RTL is for if you're in a language that writes from right to left, you want to use that file. We're not doing that. I want to get rid of all those. Okay. So we need the reset file. There it is. I don't need the reset file for right to left. I can get rid of that. And I don't need the text formatting for right to left languages. And that leaves these files, 960 CSS, demo CSS. Okay, now demo CSS is the CSS for that particular page. These 3 files are the ones you need to start a 960 website. So first you want the reset, then you want to format the text, and then you want to bring in the 960 CSS in that order. Because remember, they cascade and they override things in each other. Okay. This is where you put a link for your custom CSS, and you don't have to call it demo. You can call it my style or whatever. Whatever you want to call your CSS file. And any CSS that you use goes in this file. Okay. And there's a good reason for that. If we ever update our 960 system, it will override these 3 files, and we don't want to lose any changes we've made. If we want to change something that's set in one of those files, we change it in our sheet. In our sheet, overrides what's in these sheets. That's why the order is important. Okay, so those are the files you need, plus you need your own custom CSS file. Okay. I'm not going to use the demo CSS file, but what you might do if you're starting this from scratch is use this as a starting template. Delete everything in their body. It's a lot. It's a lot for them to make all that pink grid for us. We'll get rid of everything in their body. And we can start with that because that's got everything we need. I don't like that they didn't use indents. Okay. So you know how good coders use white space, right? So there's our head section. Here's our body section, and then here's where we'll put our code. So this is a good template to start with if you're going to start with a template. And that's where I'll start off with when I start showing you how to code. I want to show you one more folder, and I'm going to stop this video, and in the next video we'll actually start some coding. There's a min folder. Actually, I'm going to show you two things. Let's open the 960 CSS file. I'm going to edit it with Notepad, and you can see what it contains. It has all these classes, .grid 1, .grid 2, .grid 3, .grid 4, all the way up to .grid 16. These dot pushes and pulls. We may talk about those later. It's got our containers. And we'll talk about the container functions in a little bit too when I actually show you some coding. Alpha and omega. And then container grid 12, we have grid 1, grid 2, grid 4, grid 5. I wonder where the grid 3 is at. Oh, I see why that. We don't have to worry about that right now. They're down here. Container 16. All the different things that you might be using in these classes. I will show you. This looks like a lot of stuff to remember, but it's actually really easy once you start using it. Okay. These prefixes and suffixes, you may or may not use most of the stuff. Okay, but it's there if you need it. And I'll explain how to use it later. So it's a big giant file of pre-made classes with different little settings in here. Okay. And then it's got a clear class. That comes in handy. And you know what to clear floats, right? So we have a class that's built in to clear a float if we need to clear a float. And there's a clear fix class that kind of does the same thing. Talk about that too. All right. So it's just a lot of stuff provided to us. Now I'm going to come look in the min folder. And the min folder has versions of all that CSS as well. Let's open the 960 CSS file from the min folder. And here it is. And look, it's one line. There are absolutely no spaces. And if I start scrolling across, you can see, if you want to go through it and look, every bit of code that's in this 960 file is also in the minimum version of the 960 file. This version takes less space. It's 6 kilobytes. If I look at the regular CSS file, it's 10 kilobytes. Almost, it's 60% of the size. So the idea here is you develop your code with this, but then you can substitute the minimum versions in for your code when you put it on your website, and it saves a little bit of bandwidth and a little bit less files that have to be downloaded, smaller files, pages load faster. So I usually don't use the minimums, probably because I work in classrooms so much. But if I was running a real website, I would use these so I can look at the file and go through and find things that I might need. But when you're done, you take the minimum version and you replace it as your main file. All right, in the next video, I will actually start doing a sample layout and we'll show you how the system works.